I gave my daughter my $20 million business. She fired me the next day. Those words still echo in my mind. The moment I heard them, everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, seemed to come crashing down. I never imagined this would happen. Never in my wildest dreams. My daughter, the one I had nurtured, guided, and trusted, the one I thought would carry my legacy forward, had just turned on me, and in the coldest, most ruthless way possible. It all started when I made the decision to pass the business on to her. I had built my empire from scratch, $20 million in value, the product of years of hard work, countless late nights, and untold sacrifices. I had poured everything into it, blood, sweat, and tears, and as I got older, I knew it was time to think about the future. I wanted to make sure the business didn't just survive but thrived after I was gone. My daughter had always been involved in the business. She had shown interest from a young age, and I thought she was the natural choice to take over. After all, she was my flesh and blood. She understood the company, its operations, its values. So I did what any father would do. I entrusted her with my life's work. I gave her the keys to the kingdom. I handed her the reins of the $20 million business that had taken me decades to build, thinking she would honor that trust, that she would carry on my legacy with the same passion, the same drive I had. But instead, she betrayed me. She fired me the next day. The moment she said those words, "Dad, pack your office, you're done here," it felt like a punch to the gut. I stood there in her office, stunned, unable to move. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I had spent years preparing her for this role. I had groomed her to take over the business, teaching her everything I knew. We had discussed it at length, over dinners, in meetings, late into the night. She had always seemed eager, always so capable. So why now? Why this? It didn't make sense. But there was something in her eyes that told me this was no accident. This wasn't a sudden decision. She had been planning this. I could see it in her face, the coldness, the detachment. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment for years, biding her time, getting ready to strike when I least expected it. As I stood there, frozen in disbelief, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a business decision, it was personal. She had betrayed me, the person who had given her everything. But here's what she didn't know. I had been 3 steps ahead of her over the past few months. As the cracks in our relationship started to show, I had begun to document every conversation we had about the business transfer, every meeting, every discussion about the future. I wasn't blind to the fact that something was off. I started recording our conversations, knowing that one day I would need proof. She thought she was being clever, thinking I wouldn't notice her plans, but I had already seen the signs. I knew she was up to something, and I was ready for whatever she threw my way. As I left her office, trying to keep my composure, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. She may have thought she had won, but she had no idea what was coming. I wasn't about to let her take my business without a fight. Wait, it gets so much worse. What I didn't know at the time was that this betrayal was far deeper than just a simple firing. My daughter had a hidden agenda, one that involved not just taking control of the company, but destroying everything I had built. And it wasn't just her doing this. There were others involved, co-conspirators, people I trusted, people I considered friends. That's when I discovered my daughter was not working alone. There was someone else, someone close to her, who had been manipulating her, feeding her ideas, and pushing her to make this move. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about power, control, and money. I wasn't just fighting my daughter for control of my business. I was fighting a conspiracy that went deeper than I could ever have imagined. But little did she know, I had already started to gather evidence. I wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. I would fight back. I would expose the truth. And in the end, I would get my business back. As I walked out of the building, still in shock, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going down without a fight. This was far from over. You won't believe what happened next. I couldn't shake the shock of what had just happened. I had spent years building this company, nurturing it like it was my own child, only to have the person I trusted most tear it all down in an instant. But what bothered me more than anything was the why. Why would she do this? I had given her everything. She was supposed to be the future of this company. So why had she turned on me? I had a long drive home that day. As the car sped down the highway, my mind raced. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about my daughter. The daughter I thought I knew, the one I raised, the one I trusted to carry my legacy. What had changed? What had happened to her? I had been so caught up in the day-to-day running of the business, in the success and growth of it all, that I had missed the warning signs. The cracks in our relationship had been there for a long time, but I had been blind to them. Maybe I was too trusting. Maybe I didn't want to see the truth. But now, the truth was staring me in the face, and it wasn't pretty. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't going to sit idly by while she destroyed everything I had worked for. I needed answers. I needed to know what was really going on. I needed to understand what had driven her to betray me in such a cold, calculated way. The first step was to talk to some of the people who worked closest to her, the employees who had been around long enough to see the subtle changes in her behavior. I reached out to a few trusted individuals who had been with the company for years. They had watched my daughter grow up in the business, and I hoped they might have some insight into what had been happening behind the scenes. It didn't take long for the truth to start unraveling. The first person I spoke to was James, a senior employee who had been with me since the beginning. He had always been loyal, and I trusted his opinion. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I asked him directly, "What's been going on with my daughter? Has she seemed different to you lately?" James hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable. "She's been distant," he said slowly. "I noticed it a few months ago. She's been acting a little off. She started making decisions without consulting you, making deals behind your back, and I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. But now that I see what's happening, I think I know what's been going on." My heart sank. What did he mean by that? "James, what are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked around nervously before speaking again. "She's been talking to someone outside the company. I think they've been pushing her to make these decisions, to take control of the business. They've been feeding her ideas, and honestly, I think they've been manipulating her. I've heard her mention it a few times, but I didn't know who it was. She didn't seem like herself." I could feel the anger building in my chest. My daughter, the one I had trusted, had been manipulated by someone else. She had been so blinded by ambition, so desperate for power, that she had let someone else take the reins of her mind. But wait, it gets so much worse. As James continued talking, he revealed something that made my blood run cold. "I think it's her partner," he said. "She's been spending a lot of time with him lately, making all sorts of decisions without consulting you. I don't know what's going on between them, but I know it's not good. They've been planning something. I just don't know what yet." Her partner. Of course, I had always been wary of him. He was charming, smooth-talking, and seemed to have an agenda of his own. But I never imagined he could have been the one pulling the strings behind my daughter's back. I had to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't let someone like him manipulate her, destroy everything I had worked for. But I needed more information. I reached out to my lawyer, my accountant, and a few key people in my network. I needed to understand the full extent of what had been happening. The more I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my daughter's ambition. It was about money, power, and control. That's when I discovered my daughter's financial troubles ran deeper than I could have imagined. She had been sinking deeper into debt, taking out loans, and making bad investments. She had been using the company's funds to cover her personal expenses, all while pushing forward with plans to take the company for herself. But there was more. I found out that she had been making secret deals with competitors, cutting them in on the business. She had been planning to sell parts of the company without my knowledge, leaving me with nothing. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear. She wasn't just taking the company from me, she was trying to destroy it, and she had an entire team behind her, working to make sure I would never see the business again. Little did she know, I was gathering evidence. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I wasn't going to let her take my life's work without a fight. I had always been a man of integrity, someone who believed in doing things the right way. But my daughter had forced me into a corner, and now I had to play the game her way. It was time to fight back. As I sat in my office that night, reviewing the documents and evidence I had gathered, I made a vow to myself. I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her destroy everything I had built. I was going to take back what was mine and make sure she paid for what she had done. The days that followed my daughter's betrayal were a blur of emotions, confusion, and determination. It wasn't enough that I had been betrayed by the person I trusted most. I had to face the harsh reality that she wasn't working alone. There were others, co-conspirators working behind the scenes to take what was mine. I knew that if I didn't act fast, Everything I had worked for would slip through my fingers. I wasn't about to let that happen. I wasn't going to let her or anyone else destroy my legacy. I had to uncover the full extent of this conspiracy. Who were these people? How deep did this go? And most importantly, what was their plan? The first thing I did was meet with my private investigator, David. I had worked with him before on smaller cases, and I trusted his discretion and skill. I briefed him on everything I had discovered so far, the strange behavior, the secret meetings, the hidden financial transactions. I needed him to dig deeper, to find out exactly what was going on behind my back. David was a professional, a man who could move in the shadows without being noticed. Within a few days, he returned with some chilling information. "I've been following your daughter's movements, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice low and serious, "and I've uncovered something that's going to make your blood boil." My stomach churned. "What is it?" He slid a folder across the table to me. I opened it, my heart racing as I saw the first piece of evidence. It was a series of emails between my daughter and several business associates, all of whom I had never heard of. They were discussing the transfer of company assets, shares, and intellectual property. But it wasn't just that. They were also discussing plans to sell parts of the business off to competitors, without my knowledge or approval. I scanned the emails, my hands shaking as I realized the full extent of what had been happening. My daughter had been planning to dismantle the company from the inside, selling it piece by piece. She had been working with outside investors, brokers, and competitors to ensure that she could take control of the business and make millions in the process. And all this time, I had been blind to it, David continued. "The person she's been working with is a businessman named Richard Carter. He's the one pulling the strings, pushing her to make these decisions. From what I can gather, he's promised her a significant stake in the company once everything is sold off." Richard Carter, the name hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew who he was, a well-known figure in the business world, a man with a reputation for aggressive deals and questionable ethics. But I had never imagined he would be the one behind my daughter's betrayal. David handed me more documents, financial records, contracts, and meeting notes. It was all falling into place. My daughter's financial troubles, her increasing distance from me, and the strange deals she had been making, they were all connected. She was in over her head, and Carter had been taking full advantage of her desperation. But wait, it gets so much worse. David wasn't done yet. "There's more," he said, his tone grim. "I've tracked down a series of financial transactions that don't make sense. Large sums of money were transferred from the company's accounts into an offshore account registered in her name. It's almost like she was planning to funnel the company's profits into her own pocket before the sale went through." I felt my blood boiled. This wasn't just corporate betrayal. This was theft. She had been using the company's money to line her own pockets, all while plotting to take it for herself. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal. She had been so consumed by greed, by her desire to prove herself, that she had lost sight of the values I had instilled in her. She had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. That's when I discovered the extent of her manipulation. It wasn't just her partner and the outside investors who were in on the scheme. There were people inside the company, employees, trusted associates who had been helping her. Some were just as greedy as she was, while others were scared, pressured into helping her by the promises of power and money. I had always prided myself on being a fair and just leader. I had always treated my employees with respect, given them opportunities to grow. But now, I realized that some of them had been plotting against me, working with my daughter to tear everything down. I knew I had to confront her, but this time, I wasn't going to do it alone. I had the evidence, the documents, the financial records. I had the truth on my side, and I was ready to expose her for what she had done. The next few days were a whirlwind. I met with my lawyer to discuss my options, and we began preparing for the confrontation. We knew this would be a battle, one that could cost us everything. But I wasn't afraid. I had been through too much to back down now. As the days passed, the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was personal. It was a battle for everything I had worked for, everything I had built, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. Little did she know, the moment was coming when I would lay all of this out in front of her, when I would confront her with the truth, the emails, the money, the lies, when she would see that I had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. But I wasn't just fighting for my business, I was fighting for my dignity. my legacy, and I would make sure she understood the consequences of her actions. You won't believe what happened next. The stage was set, and the pieces were in place. The final confrontation was coming, and I was ready to take back what was mine. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with a strange mix of anger, determination, and calculated focus. I knew I had the evidence, the truth, and the upper hand, but that didn't mean I could afford to make a misstep. This wasn't just about me and my daughter anymore. This was about survival. This was about saving the company and ensuring that the betrayal she had orchestrated didn't destroy everything I had worked for. My lawyer, Martin, was now fully involved in the process. He had been by my side for years, a trusted advisor through the highs and lows of running the business. We were working closely to craft a strategy. But it wasn't just legal tactics we had to focus on. The next steps involved more than just playing by the book. The emotional toll this was taking on me was undeniable. I had to balance my role as a father with my duty as a businessman, and I knew that if I allowed my emotions to dictate my actions, I would lose everything. The first thing Martin and I did was set up a series of contingency plans. I wasn't going to walk into this situation blindly. We needed backup. If things got out of hand, if my daughter tried to fight back or pull any more surprises, I needed to be prepared for every possible outcome. We began by securing the company's assets, freezing accounts where necessary, and moving valuable intellectual property into protected holdings. I knew that my daughter had been preparing to sell parts of the company off to competitors, and I wasn't going to let that happen. We made sure that everything of value was locked down before we confronted her. If she thought she was going to walk away with my business, she was sorely mistaken. But wait, it gets so much worse. As Martin and I were finalizing the details, we discovered that my daughter had already begun to take steps to remove me from the company's leadership. She had been subtly manipulating board members and high-level executives, planting seeds of doubt about my leadership, and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. I had always been the one to make the tough decisions, the one who had built the company from the ground up, but now, I was being painted as an obstacle to progress. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She had been working behind the scenes to take full control of the company. And in her mind, I was just another hurdle to be removed. The board members who I had trusted, who I had worked with for years, were now questioning my ability to lead. It was as if everything I had worked for was crumbling beneath my feet. That's when I discovered something that completely changed the course of the investigation. I had been so focused on my daughter and her partner that I hadn't paid attention to the finer details, specifically the board minutes and financial reports. After a deep dive into the documents, I found a strange series of meetings that had taken place without my knowledge. These meetings weren't just about business strategy, they were about me. They were about taking me down. The more I dug into these secret meetings, the more I realized that there had been whispers, rumors, and plans being hatched in the shadows. It wasn't just my daughter. The board members who had been so loyal to me for years had been quietly working against me. Some were motivated by money, some by ambition, and others by the promise of power once I was out of the picture. But the most shocking discovery was the involvement of my daughter's partner, Richard Carter. He wasn't just a businessman looking to make a deal. He had been orchestrating the entire thing from the very beginning. He had convinced my daughter to push me out, to sell off the company, and to use the business's success as a springboard for his own personal gain. The betrayal was far deeper than I could have imagined. My daughter, Richard, and a handful of trusted board members were all complicit in a plot to steal my legacy, and they thought they could get away with it. Little did she know, I wasn't just going to stand by and let her destroy everything I had built. I had one card left to play the final confrontation. I wasn't going to just walk into that room and let them tell me what I had lost. I was going to walk in with the full truth, armed with the evidence that would expose every single one of them. I called a special board meeting, one that would be the stage for the showdown I had been preparing for. I knew this wouldn't be easy, and I knew that there would be resistance. My daughter was going to fight back, and the board members who had turned against me would do everything in their power to keep the power in their hands. But I had a plan. I had been quietly gathering support from the few loyal employees who remained, from the ones who still believed in the company's mission, in its future. They were the ones who had watched my daughter change, who had seen her manipulation and lies firsthand. They were the ones who would help me expose the truth. I met with them in secret, making sure that everything was in place for the meeting. They were ready, and so was I. It wasn't just about saving the business anymore. It was about making sure that my daughter understood the consequences of her actions. She had betrayed me, yes, but she had also betrayed the people who had believed in her, the employees who had given their all for the company. We were ready for war. You won't believe what happened next. The board meeting was set, the trap was laid, and the moment of truth was fast approaching. My daughter had no idea what was coming for her. She thought she had already won. But I was about to turn the tables. The day of the board meeting arrived, and as I walked into the conference room, I could feel the tension in the air. The same room where I had made countless decisions that had shaped the company into what it was today. The walls, which once felt like they held my victories, now seemed to echo with doubt and betrayal. I had been the one to build this empire. But now I was the outsider, the one everyone was conspiring against. My daughter sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her eyes cold and calculating. Richard Carter, her partner, stood beside her, a smug smile playing on his lips. The other board members, the ones who I thought I could trust, sat around the table, their faces unreadable. Some were visibly uncomfortable, but others, those who had been feeding my daughter's ambition, looked at me with barely concealed disdain. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. I had never felt so powerless in my life, yet somehow, I was in control. I wasn't going to let them see the fear that threatened to rise within me. I had to stay focused. I had to expose the truth. The meeting began like any other, with a brief rundown of the company's performance, but there was something different about this one. The usual camaraderie was gone. Instead, there was an undercurrent of hostility. It was like they were waiting for me to make a move. I let them speak for a while, knowing that they expected me to argue, to beg, to try and convince them that I was still the leader of this company, but I wasn't going to do that. Not anymore. When the time was right, I cleared my throat and stood up. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. It was my moment. I know what's been happening here, I said, my voice steady but laced with anger. I know what you've been plotting, and I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've worked for, not without a fight. The room was still. My daughter's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or guilt, but she quickly masked it with a look of defiance. Richard Carter crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, a smirk still on his face. He clearly thought this was all just a formality, a minor roadblock before he took full control. What are you talking about? My daughter asked, her voice tight, almost as if she was trying to hold on to some semblance of control. You're not in charge anymore, Dad. You're out. You don't get to make the decisions. Is that so? I replied, my eyes locked on hers. I think you'll find that I'm still the majority shareholder, and I'm not going anywhere. I could feel the heat rise in the room. This was it, the moment when the entire scheme would come to light. I've been gathering evidence, I said, pulling out a folder from my briefcase. Evidence that proves you've been working with Richard Carter to take control of this company, to dismantle it, piece by piece, and sell it off for your own gain. Her face blanched, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she quickly recovered, her walls going back up. She wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. You're insane, she spat. This is all just a misunderstanding. I'm doing what's best for the company. But I wasn't listening to her lies anymore. I opened the folder and slid the documents across the table. The room was filled with the sound of shuffling papers as the board members began to review the evidence. They were already starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats. These are emails, I continued, showing that you've been planning to sell parts of the company off to competitors. You've been working with Richard Carter and a few others to arrange for the sale of our most valuable assets. You've been taking money from the company and funneling it into offshore accounts, and you thought I wouldn't notice. I could see her jaw tighten as she glanced around the table, but she remained silent, refusing to acknowledge the truth. You've been using the company's resources to cover your own personal debts, I added, flipping through more papers. Here are the financial records that show how you've been embezzling money for months. You thought I wouldn't catch on, but I've been 3 steps ahead the entire time. There was a long silence as the board members read through the documents. Some of them looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Others, those who had been involved, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. And then, the first crack appeared. One of the board members, Thomas, who had always been one of my most loyal, stood up, his face flushed with guilt. I didn't know it was this bad, he admitted, his voice shaking. I thought she was just doing what was necessary. I didn't realize. He trailed off, and the weight of his admission hit everyone in the room. Slowly, others began to speak up. One by one, they turned their backs on my daughter and Richard, their loyalty shifting from her to me. "You won't get away with this," I said, my voice cold and final. "I'm not going to let you ruin everything I've worked for. And if you think you can just walk away from this without facing consequences, you're wrong." I turned to Richard Carter, who had been sitting there, smug and selfish. But now, he was no longer smiling. The truth was coming out, and he knew his time was up. "You're finished," I said to him, "and so is she." But the real shock came when I made my final move. I had already called in the authorities, the financial regulators, and even my personal legal team to ensure that everything would be handled. My daughter and Richard Carter were not just facing a corporate battle, they were facing criminal charges: embezzlement, conspiracy, fraud. I had always been a man of integrity, and now I was going to make sure that my company, my legacy, would survive this betrayal. The board had been shaken to its core, but they could see the truth now. They knew where their loyalty should lie. The game was over. But little did she know, this was just the beginning of the end. The real consequences were yet to come. "You won't believe what happened next. You said." Next, ChatGPT said. Chapter 6. The ultimate twist. The boardroom was dead silent, and the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. My daughter, her face pale, tried to keep her composure, but I could see the cracks forming. Her entire plan was crumbling before her eyes. The world she had built for herself, the one where she thought she could walk away with the company and all its assets, was unraveling. I had the documents, the evidence, and the support of the board now. It felt like a win, but I knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just about getting my business back. This was about something far deeper. It was about teaching my daughter a lesson she would never forget. She needed to understand the consequences of her actions, the betrayal of me, her family, and the company that had been my life's work. But I hadn't anticipated what happened next. After the board members began speaking out against her, I thought the confrontation was over. The pieces had all fallen into place. But as I sat there, watching my daughter's face twist with anger and desperation, she suddenly did something I wasn't expecting. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope, her hands shaking. My heart sank as she placed it on the table, her eyes defiant as she looked at me. "This isn't over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think you've won. You have no idea what you're dealing with." She slid the envelope across the table, and my stomach churned as I opened it. Inside were documents, legal documents, contracts, and an agreement with the very company that had been working with her and Richard Carter. But there was something more sinister hidden within these papers. These were not just business agreements. They were the groundwork for a full-fledged takeover, a plan that went much deeper than I could have ever imagined. There were clauses in these contracts that transferred ownership of the business to her without my knowledge, without my consent. It was all in the fine print. The company that I had built was now, in essence, hers. Wait. It gets so much worse. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about money or assets anymore. This was a personal attack. She had been planning this for years, using legal loopholes to take control of my business. She had not only stolen from me, but had also strategically planned a way to cut me out completely. That's when I discovered the final piece of the puzzle. My daughter had used her position to manipulate the company's legal framework, making sure that everything she did was technically legal even if it wasn't moral. She had outsmarted me at my own game, but I wasn't about to back down. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members who had turned on me. They were just as shocked as I was. My daughter had played them too. She had convinced them that this takeover was necessary, that it was the only way for the company to survive in an increasingly competitive market. She had made them think I was the problem, but now they could see the truth. "You didn't just betray me," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You betrayed everything this company stood for. You thought you could walk away with everything, but you're wrong. You've underestimated me." She stared at me, defiant but shaking with fear. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor. The guilt and regret that had been building inside her were now showing on her face, though she wouldn't admit it. But little did she know, I wasn't going to play by the rules she had set. I had been planning this for weeks, and now I was ready to execute my final move. I had already spoken to the legal team. I had already made sure that every document, every agreement, was voided. The legal agreements she had set up to transfer control of the business were invalid, and I had the proof to back it up. The shock on her face was almost satisfying. She thought she had outsmarted me, thought she had won, but the truth was, she had made one critical mistake. What I found next changed everything. I had one last card to play. I had contacted a trusted legal advisor, someone who specialized in corporate law, and they had discovered a flaw in the legal documents my daughter had signed, a critical error, one that made her entire takeover null and void. I had evidence of fraud, manipulation, and illegal actions that not only destroyed her credibility but also implicated Richard Carter and a number of the board members. It was clear now my daughter had tried to force me out of my own company, but she had used illegal means to do so, and now, everything she had worked for was coming to an end. As I stood up, feeling the weight of this victory settle on my shoulders, I looked at my daughter one last time. "You've made your choices," I said, my voice steady and resolute, "and now, you'll have to face the consequences." She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. There was no escape. The truth had come out. She had lost. You won't believe what happened next. The legal actions were already in motion, and the board members who had sided with her were now scrambling to cover their tracks. They knew what was coming. There was no way they could escape the fallout from this betrayal. My daughter's partner, Richard Carter, was the next to fall. As the pieces of the conspiracy came to light, he found himself caught in a web of legal troubles that he couldn't escape. The once confident businessman was now facing criminal charges for his involvement in the plot. And my daughter, she was facing charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, and fraud, crimes that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It wasn't just the business I had reclaimed, it was my dignity, my honor, and my legacy. The final twist had come. I had won, but it came at a price that would forever change my relationship with my daughter, and one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The battle was over, but the war had taken everything from me. Her final desperate move was exactly what I'd been waiting for. She had given me everything I needed to reclaim my business, and I was going to make sure that she would never forget the price of betrayal. The aftermath of the confrontation was nothing short of a whirlwind. The legal battles, the fallout from the boardroom, and the public spectacle that followed it was all happening so fast. In the span of just a few days, everything had changed. My daughter, who had once been my pride and joy, was now my adversary. Richard Carter, her partner in crime, was facing a future behind bars, and the company, the one I had spent my entire life building, was now back under my control. But as I sat in my office, looking out over the city skyline, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something much more valuable than just a business. I had lost the relationship with my daughter. The bond that we once shared was now shattered beyond repair. I had spent years preparing her for this moment, teaching her everything I knew about business, leadership, and success. I had hoped she would take the company to new heights, surpassing even my own achievements. But in the end, her ambition, greed, and desire for power had led her to destroy everything I had worked for. And yet, as much as I wanted to hate her for what she had done, a part of me couldn't. She was still my daughter. I still loved her, even after everything that had happened. But love, I realized, wasn't enough to repair the damage that had been done. The legal actions were swift. Charges of embezzlement, fraud, conspiracies, these weren't just minor offenses. They were serious crimes, and the evidence was overwhelming. My daughter was facing years of legal battles, and I wasn't sure how it would end for her. All I knew was that the path she had chosen had led her down a dark road, one that would take years to recover from if she ever could. Richard Carter, too, was in deep trouble. His business dealings had been exposed, and his reputation was destroyed. The once charismatic man was now facing criminal charges of his own. The partnership between him and my daughter had crumbled, and with it, any hope of escaping the consequences of their actions. But for me, the legal victory was just the beginning. The real work was about to begin. The company needed to be rebuilt. The board needed to be restructured. And most importantly, I needed to reestablish my leadership and trust within the company. I wasn't going to let the legacy I had built be tainted by this betrayal. What happened next, though, would surprise everyone. In the weeks that followed, I took charge of the company once more, but I did it differently this time. I didn't want to make the same mistakes I had before. I knew I had to lead with both strength and compassion. The employees, many of whom had been loyal to me for years, were shaken by the events that had unfolded. They had seen what betrayal could do to a family, to a business. They were scared, but they were also eager for leadership. They needed someone to show them the way forward. I called a company-wide meeting. The employees filled the room, their faces a mix of hope, confusion, and fear. I stood in front of them, looking out over the sea of faces that had been with me from the beginning. These were the people who had worked tirelessly to help build the company into what it was. And now, they were watching me, wondering what would happen next. "I know things have been difficult," I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know you've all been through a lot. But we're going to rebuild. We're going to learn from what's happened and come out stronger on the other side. This company belongs to all of us. It's not just mine, it's yours, too." The room was silent, but I could see the relief in their eyes. They wanted hope. They wanted to believe that things could get better. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the people who had stood by me, who had believed in the company's mission. It was about rebuilding the trust that had been broken, not just with my daughter, but with everyone who had supported me. "I'm not going to let what happened destroy us," I continued. "We have an opportunity now to rebuild, to make this company better than ever. We'll work together, and we'll make sure that this kind of betrayal never happens again. But it starts with all of us working as a team. We're in this together." And with that, something shifted in the room. The tension lifted. Slowly, the employees began to nod, to look at each other with renewed resolve. The company was far from perfect, and it had a long way to go. But I knew that with the right leadership, we could move forward. Little did I know, the true transformation had already begun. I wasn't just rebuilding a business, I was rebuilding myself. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus on personal growth as much as professional recovery. I took the time to reconnect with the values that had first driven me to start this business: the integrity, the dedication, and the passion for helping others. I sought advice from mentors, reevaluated my leadership style, and worked to become a better, more compassionate leader. But as I continued to rebuild, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between me and my daughter. I wanted to believe that time could heal the wounds, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The damage had been done. "You won't believe what happened next. One day, I received a letter from my daughter. She had been through the court proceedings, and though the legal battles weren't over, she had come to a realization. She apologized. It was the first time in months that she had reached out to me, and when I read her words, I realized just how broken she was. She had made mistakes, terrible ones, but she was still my daughter, and while the road to reconciliation would be long and hard, the seed of hope had been planted. The business was back on track. The company was thriving again. But my personal journey, my relationship with my daughter, was far from over. The final chapter is not written yet. There would be more obstacles to overcome, more challenges ahead. But I had learned something invaluable. In the face of betrayal, there is still a chance for redemption. And while I couldn't change the past, I had the power to shape the future. The story of the $20 million business, the family betrayal, and the lessons learned was not just a story of loss. It was a story of transformation, of resilience, and of the unwavering belief that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. The days following my daughter's apology were a blur. I had spent so much time focused on the company, on rebuilding it, getting it back to its rightful place, that I had almost forgotten about what truly mattered. The company was thriving once again, and the board had rallied around me, reaffirming their trust in my leadership. But despite the success of the business, something was missing. My relationship with my daughter was fractured, and that wound wasn't healing as quickly as I had hoped. I spent hours sitting in my office, looking out over the city, reflecting on everything that had happened: the betrayal, the confrontation, the court cases, the boardroom battles, the strained relationship with my daughter, who had once been the person I trusted the most. How did we get here? How did we lose sight of what really mattered? The letter from my daughter still sat on my desk. Her words were a reminder of the deep pain she had caused, but also of the hope that perhaps, one day, we could rebuild what had been lost. It wasn't an easy thing to forgive. Betrayal never is. But the question lingered: could I truly forgive her, and could she ever forgive herself for what she had done? As much as I had focused on the business, I had neglected the most important part of all: my family. And now, after everything that had happened, I was forced to confront the reality that sometimes business is not just about numbers, deals, and success. Sometimes it's about the people in your life, the ones who stand by you when the going gets tough, the ones who you share your dreams and failures with. The company was secure, but I wasn't sure how to secure my relationship with my daughter. Forgiveness wasn't an automatic choice, it was something I had to work through, something I had to earn. I had to find it in myself to let go of the bitterness that had built up over the past few months. I needed to approach this from a place of empathy and understanding, not as the father who had been betrayed, but as a father who still loved his daughter and wanted to help her find her way back. But the real challenge lay ahead. I knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean sweeping everything under the rug and pretending like nothing had happened. It meant acknowledging the hurt, the loss, and the damage that had been done and finding a way to move forward, step by step, together. I reached out to her. I didn't know what I expected from the conversation, but I knew I had to try. The pain was still raw, but I couldn't let that prevent me from doing the right thing. She agreed to meet me at a small cafe, one we used to visit often when she was younger. It was a place filled with memories, but also a place that felt like a safe space where we could talk without the weight of the past looming over us. I arrived early, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for her. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. The once confident young woman, eager to take over the business, now looked fragile and uncertain. The weight of what she had done seemed to hang over her. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in months, we didn't say anything. We just looked at each other, both of us carrying the heavy burden of the past. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never should have done it. I betrayed you, and I don't know how to make it right." I looked at her, my heart breaking. She was vulnerable now, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the weight of the mistakes she had made, and as much as the pain still lingered, I knew I had to let it go. This was my daughter. She had made mistakes, but that didn't mean I had to throw away everything we had. "I know," I said softly, "and it's going to take time, but I'm willing to work through this with you. We can rebuild together." We sat there in silence for a while, just absorbing the gravity of the conversation. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a sudden fix, but it was the beginning of something new, a new chapter for us both. What I found next was unexpected as we talked. I realized that the betrayal wasn't just something I had to forgive. She had to forgive herself, too. She had been carrying the weight of her decisions, thinking that she could never make things right. But I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in months, a willingness to change, to grow, to earn back the trust she had lost. And I knew in that moment that this wasn't just about me forgiving her. It was about both of us taking responsibility for the broken pieces and working together to put them back together. We couldn't undo the damage, but we could start over. Little did we know, this was only the beginning of a long, slow process. It wasn't easy. There were times when I still felt the sting of betrayal, and I'm sure she did too. But we took small steps, talking more, rebuilding the trust we had lost. We didn't expect everything to be perfect right away, but we both knew that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about commitment, effort, and understanding. And in that process, I learned something important. As much as I had been focused on rebuilding the company, it was my relationship with her that truly mattered. The business would survive, but family, it's something you can't take for granted. It's something you have to nurture. Even when the storms of life try to tear it apart, you won't believe what happened next. Months later, my daughter and I stood together, side by side, in front of the company's headquarters. The business was stronger than ever, and for the first time in a long while, we were working together. The tension that had once defined our relationship was now replaced by mutual respect, understanding, and a shared commitment to moving forward. The business, once just a dream, had become a symbol of resilience, not just for me, but for both of us. We had both made mistakes, but we were committed to building something stronger, together. I looked at her and smiled, knowing that we had both come a long way. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I had hope. We had hope, and that was enough to start again. The journey was far from over, but we had finally begun to heal, and the future, whatever it held, was ours to shape, together.